Okay, so we'll continue on our theme. Uh, know thy enemy. Right? So, the idea is uh, how does an earthquake affect a structure? कुछ आइडिया है इस बारे में? Any idea about how does an earthquake affect a structure? It's very fundamentally different from whatever you have encountered so far. First thing that you need to understand is no direct forces are applied. Much to the contrary to the popular belief that whatever we refer to as earthquake forces, there is no such thing as earthquake forces. Earthquake, as the name suggests, is only ground vibration, and it imposes certain deformations. So now any elastic body will develop internal forces in response to deformation. It is like this. This is a standard textbook example in any structural analysis course. This is a fixed beam, and this beam undergoes certain sinking of supports, delta, displacement delta, right? So what are the forces acting on this beam? There is no external force as such, but there are stress resultants that will act on this beam. There is going to be bending moment because of these deformations, and there is going to be shear force in order to counteract this bending moment so that the entire system remains in equilibrium. And you will find that what are the moments? Any ideas?
6EI delta upon L square.
6EI by L square, that's right.
6EI delta upon L square.
6EI by L square multiplied by delta, if that is the deformations. This is also 6EI by L square multiplied by delta, and this is going to be 12EI by L cube. Again multiplied by delta, right? So this is what happens. All of you are familiar with this. Now the situation in earthquake is some kind little bit similar. I just turn it around by 90 degrees and I have this situation. M and K. During vibration, this entire thing vibrates like this. Right? So you can imagine this. I mean, this resembles more or less quite a bit like inverted pendulum, except that this is thread is not taking a rigid line, I mean it's not moving as a rigid, straight line, there are elastic deformations in this column. So the point that I wish to bring out here is, because of this ground vibration, this entire structure is vibrating, is set into vibration, and it is because of these vibrations there are forces developed in the columns and the base reaction moments, overturning moments, and this has to be withstood by the structure. I mean, these are the internal stress resultants, and the sections have to be designed to withstand these stress resultants. So what is most important thing for you to understand the basic difference, that in earthquakes there is no direct forces acting on the system, right? Whatever is happening, it is happening because of the vibrations, it is happening because of the deformations. So whatever we write, equation of motion, if I draw the spring mass dashpot analog of single degree of freedom system, so the free body diagram, if you draw, this is under the stretch, spring is under stretch, K times let's say ut is total displacements minus ug, and then c times total velocity of mass minus velocity of the ground motion, and then this is total displacement of the mass ut, and obviously for these forces there is a reaction from the support that you can have it, so that these forces are in equilibrium. Right now, Newton's second law of momentum states that all forces acting on this mass m, so what are the forces acting on mass m? So minus c times, let's say u is total displacements minus ground displacement. So this is the relative, u is the relative deformation of the spring, relative motion of the mass m with respect to base. So cu dot minus ku is equal to rate of change of momentum of the mass, so that is mass times, now that is, oh sorry, this is only one velocity. So total velocity, so rate of change of momentum, and momentum is based on the total velocity. So this, I can write this as so relative velocity plus the ground velocity, right? And this is where you get this equation of motion. Now I can always write this in the form which we feel comfortable with, that total force equilibrium, and it is also convenient in terms of relative displacements. Now this is what we call as effective force and mark it as a function of time t. Now this is only a mathematical representation of the reality. It just casts the phenomena of this second law of motion, that is net force. These are the forces acting on the body, acting on the mass m, and none of these forces are actually external forces. Both of these forces are resulting because of the deformation in the system, right? Because the mass has moved relative to the base motion, that is what is causing these forces on the mass, and these forces have to be equal to the rate of change of momentum of the mass, how fast the momentum is changing. If the momentum is not changing much, then there is no force acting on this, right? So mass, it moves as a rigid body and there is no internal forces, right? So that is the basic idea. So when we have when we cast this, then this is of course familiar to in the form that it is a statement of equilibrium of forces, all the forces, and we cast it as a effective force. But remember that this is only for the mathematical convenience of casting the phenomena in a form that is comfortable for us to deal with, right? This is what you see here is not a force. Okay, why is it not a force? I have been taking lot of pains. I always take lot of pains to say that this is not a force, we just call it a effective force. Why is this not a force, or for that matter this term? This is obviously rate of change of momentum, right? This is, let me so why is this not a force? Anybody? Can anyone think about it and tell me?
Maybe because we are not applying it, because it is a reaction of change of momentum, not an action which is done by.
That's right. It is not a force by virtue of Newton's third law, that is law of reaction. What does it say? For every action, what is action? Action is a force. There is an equal and opposite reaction. That's the statement of the law. Now if you look at it, there is a reaction for these forces, for the spring force, for the damper force. These are the reaction, right? There is no reaction whatsoever for this rate of change of momentum. We just say, if you look at any dynamics book carefully, when they talk about D'Alembert's principle, they would always refer to this as fictitious inertia force. Keyword is fictitious. It is something like a force quantity. The units, of course, match. Right hand side has to be equal to left hand side. So the force has to be equal to this rate of change of momentum, but it is not a force because there is no reaction for this quantity. No reaction is developing for this quantity anywhere in the system, and therefore it is not a force. So whatever you are getting here, these are all internal forces which are forced upon the structure by virtue of the deformations it is undergoing because of the vibrations that have been set in motion by the elastic properties and the inertia, momentum and inertia. Inertia because this, it takes some time to respond. So when this point starts moving here, mass is still at rest. It doesn't know that it has to move. It takes some time before the signal reaches it, and then it starts to move. By that time, there is already a considerable stretch in the deformation. There is already a considerable movement of the ground, and there is this column is already under stress, right? And then when this mass moves, this has already changed its direction, and base is moving in this direction and the mass is moving in the other direction, and that's how you get this vibration in the system. So that is by virtue of the inertia, the system takes some time before it responds, and by virtue of that differential difference in timings in responding, you have these elastic deformations in the system, and that is what is causing the stresses, internal stresses in the system. So first thing that you need to understand is that earthquake really doesn't impose any forces, direct forces. All that it does is impose deformation, right? So let me write it in red. It imposes, okay, deformations on the structure. Right? So the key to earthquake resistant design is to control deformations. If I can control the deformations, then obviously the forces would be reduced, and demands on the structure would be reduced, and structure would be safe. So that's a challenge, how to control the deformations. There are different strategies, but keep this in mind, whatever we do in earthquake resistant design is essentially to control the deformations. If we are able to control the deformations, we would be able to control the demands that are being put on the structure, and it would be easier for us to provide for those smaller demands coming onto the structure, right? So this is the cornerstone of this particular statement, is the cornerstone of earthquake resistant design. All that we do is try to find ways to control the deformations. Now, although the emphasis is on controlling the deformation, we still refer to these strategies. It's a legacy of the past, but that's how we have to live with it. Uh, I'll tell you why I think it is a legacy of the past, because it is still referred to by this term in all the textbooks. We call these as lateral load resisting elements. So we talk of structural members which are capable of resisting lateral loads. Now obviously this seems to be a contradiction of terms. On the one hand, I say that earthquakes do not impose any loads, any forces, and on the second hand, I am talking about earthquake resistant design involves provision of lateral load resisting elements. What are the features through which lateral loads are resisted, right? Now it so happens that it may not be that earthquake is imposing direct forces, but it is imposing deformations. It is imposing deformations in horizontal direction, it is imposing deformations in vertical direction as well, all three directions, right? So earthquakes do impose the deformation. Now it so happens that load and deformation are intrinsically linked. If I have a feature which resists load in the horizontal direction, it will also resist the deformations in the horizontal direction or the lateral load. For example, this is fine. This beam actually resists this imposed deformation, but this beam is also capable of resisting the loads coming on the normal to the transverse to the axis of the beam, right? So the structural member is same. The structural solution is still the same, irrespective of whether I have to provide for these loads or whether I have to provide for these deformations, right? The end mechanics of the structural member remains the same, right? And therefore we still talk about lateral load resisting elements, and this has a historical context. Where do we come about this lateral load resisting elements? Please excuse me, I'll join in a short while. So although we call it load resisting elements, the primary emphasis, the structural element remains the same. It can resist both the loads coming on the horizontal plane as well as it can resist the deformations coming in the horizontal plane. So the structural member remains the same, although the function is different. These same lateral load resisting elements will help in the resistance of wind loads. Wind loads are actually the loads. In that we are actually getting the loads directly coming on these structural elements, right? So whatever we talk about lateral load resisting elements, more or less the same features help us in countering the wind forces as well as the earthquake effects. I desist from referring to earthquake effects as earthquake forces, because fundamentally earthquakes only impose deformations. The internal stress resultants that result are by virtue of those deformations that are imposed on the structure, right? So there are no direct forces acting on the system. Yes, some question?
Yes, sir. Sir, can you repeat why we are providing lateral load resisting elements when the earthquake is not imposing any load? I didn't get that.
Okay. I'll again go back to this simple fixed beam problem. Now this beam can withstand loads that are imposed on the beam, transverse loads. It will withstand these transverse loads by a string of action. This is going to be the deflected shape, right? And there would be some reaction. So this is the action of the beam. So it can support the loads coming onto the structure which are transverse to the axis of the beam, right? Now this same beam, the structural element is still the same. I have the same beam. But the situation is, now the beam is subjected to a deformation. Somehow there is a deformation between the two ends, relative to two ends of the support, right? This is what we typically solve this problem. This is typically given as a first example of first or second example of indeterminate structures, sinking of supports, right? So one support sinks by an amount delta with respect to the other support. Now please note that there is no external force acting on this beam. There is no load acting on this beam, right? But still, by virtue of this deformed shape, you can see that there is a stretch. I mean, there is going to be a moment here. I mean, it is bending. The beam is of course bending. It has to bend in order to be able to take this shape and not break. So there is a bending moment here, and in order to ensure that the equilibrium is maintained, there is going to be a set of shear forces here, right? So in this case, these are the caused by external forces, or I can say supports. External load, and here this is caused by deformations. Right? I can say this beam supports imposed deformations, right? Now the structural element that we are talking about is the same structural element. It is a simple beam, prismatic beam. Structural element in both the cases it's same. It's a flexural member, right? But the action by which it participates in the entire game is different. In this case, it is supporting there are forces, there are loads actually imposed on the structure transfers to the axis. In this case, the structural element is still the same, the mechanics is still the same, but in this case there are no loads acting on the structure, rather there is some external deformation that is imposed on the structure, and it responds to that deformation by these elastic deformation, unless it exceeds the limit, and then the entire thing ruptures. So as long as we are assuming that the beam remains continuous and elastic, then this has to deform in this kind of deformed shape, and in order to maintain this deformed shape, it has to necessarily develop these stress resultants, internal stress resultants, and only then the system will be in equilibrium. So it generates these stress resultants, deformation, by virtue of these imposed displacements. So same thing happens if I just turn this system on by 90 degrees. So this is the situation of column, right? I can say that it is a portal. So mass K by 2, and I can consider this as a simple inverted cantilever kind of a structure of mass m and stiffness k. These two stiffnesses columns, they are in parallel combination, so I can combine them, and then I can consider this as acting either withstanding this lateral force acting on the mass on this floor, which is what happens during the wind load, right? So this is the external force, let's say wind, or I can think of this same structural element which is being forced to deform by ground vibration. Now by virtue of this deformed shape that is imposed, this will also impose the shear force and bending moment on the structural member. This will also impose, if I impose this deformation instead of, so if I impose this force, again it will deform in this way. So the structural action is still the same. Right? So the members are same. It's a load resisting, lateral load resisting member, but whatever member resists the load transfers to its axis will also resist the deformations transfers to its axis, because it's essentially two sides of the coin. Force and deformation, they are intrinsically coupled. So whatever is able to resist the force will also be able to support or absorb the deformations imposed in the same direction. I hope I am able to explain the point, Hardik?
Yes, sir, it is clear.
Okay. So now, why do we call it as a earthquake resistant feature, as a lateral load resisting feature? I told you that there is a historical context. The entire business of earthquake resistant design started after in around 1923. Why is this date significant? I think 23 or 22, I think 23. There was a massive earthquake in Tokyo. entire city was destroyed. Almost entire city was ravaged. It was disastrous in the sense that not only earthquakes, but it was this particular earthquake saw the effect of earthquakes and secondary effects of earthquakes. Whatever earthquake had done, it had done, but then to compound to the problem, compound on the miseries, there were secondary effects. For example, the pipelines got burst and then they caught fire. Oil pipelines got burst and then the oil caught fire, and then there was a problem of fire. So it was fire followed by earthquake. So entire city was raged. You can now probably, if you are keeping track, all over the world we are witnessing wildfires. California, lots of forest land is gone because of these wildfires. That's an annual event there. We also have wildfires in the hills of Uttarakhand, but we do take care to prevent that. It doesn't get out of hand. So fire is, once it starts in a large scale, it is extremely difficult to control and it spreads very quickly, particularly if there is inflammable material available. And the entire city, entire Tokyo city was gutted in fire. So not much damage, probably not as much damage was observed done during earthquake. Fire did most of the damage, because earthquake actually did damage only the structural part, but fire actually burnt everything that was inside. So entire thing, entire property, everything, household and whatever you had, everything was burnt, right? So that was massive disaster. So after the earthquake, everybody was, as I said, entire city, almost entire city was ravaged to ground. Either during earthquake or after the fire following earthquake. But still, some buildings survived remarkably. Some buildings survived. So it should be plural here. So then people started looking at, the reverse engineering. I don't know whether this term was in vogue at that time, reverse engineering, but nevertheless, that's what they did. They tried to find out a reason when everything else was ravaged to ground. They could not withstand this fury of this earthquake. What made these buildings stand out, literally standing out? And when they started looking at the members, proportions and the structural details, they found something very interesting, that somehow all these buildings could withstand, they all had the structural members which could withstand load, lateral load carrying capacity. The structural system that they had, they all buildings which were found to remain standing after last building standing, they all were found to have nearly lateral load resisting capacity. If you apply a constant load at the top, rooftop, equal to 10% of the total weight of the building, that would be the force that would correspond to the limit, maximum force that it can withstand within the allowable stress limit. The design was still based on working stress method. So working stress or allowable stress. In fact, Japanese codes still are based on allowable stress method, working stress method. That's an aside. But it was found that if all these buildings, the structural members were so proportioned that they had this capacity that in addition to the gravity load, if this horizontal load at the top of the building was applied, 10% of the seismic weight, 10% of the total weight of the building, then the stresses were within allowable range. For all other buildings which collapsed, this capacity was much smaller than 10% of the weight. And that's how it came out. I mean, the first earthquake resistant guideline was actually this. You just need to design it as a static load, static horizontal load about 10% of the seismic weight acting at the top. Right? Now, that's a very useful criteria. I mean, all dynamics is out of the picture. You don't have to worry about solving differential equations, second order differential equations, initial conditions and these long time histories. All that you need to do in addition to doing for gravity load analysis, you have a building. So in addition to doing this for gravity load analysis, all that you need to do is couple it with 10% of the seismic weight and find out the forces, stress resultants in the building. And of course, this has to be in both the direction, alternatively. Once applied in this direction, once applied in this direction, and then find out whatever is the critical combination, critical value, and design the system, provide the capacities accordingly, and you have the earthquake resistance built in. So this is how the genesis of the term lateral load resisting elements. So initial earthquake resistant design provisions were actually based on application of static horizontal load at the top of the building, and the initial thrust was to built in or to come up with a structural framework which would be able to withstand this horizontal load or withstand this lateral load, and that's how we come to this definition or lateral load resisting elements. And the same terminology still continues to this date. The elements are still the same, but it is you should be aware that it is not the lateral forces that is being withstood or that is to be taken care of. Rather, it is the deformation imposed by the earthquakes that have to be taken care of. But the structural member or the structural elements remain the same. And there are other ways in which the deformations can be absorbed, and we will definitely look into those aspects as well. So technically they do not form as a part of lateral load resisting elements per se. They are what we call as energy dissipation or vibration control devices. I will stop here. Any questions?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, this lateral load capacity is 10% of seismic weight, no, sir?
That's right. Seismic weight, total weight, whatever, at that time it was just the total weight of the structure.
Sir, in 1923 when Tokyo earthquake occurred, that is of magnitude about 8, but if magnitude increase, then we need to increase the lateral load capacity, percentage capacity.
Several things happen. See, that's this 10% of seismic weight is obviously a very simplistic approach, but it is better than nothing. It was found that all the buildings which survived the earthquake, they all had this common feature. And then if something is shared by something that is proven to withstand the fury of earthquake, then obviously that is a lot of lends a lot of credence to this practice. So subsequently it was adopted in seismic design code of Japan, and then the practice spread to other countries, earthquake affected countries. And later on, as the understanding of the earthquake phenomena, earthquake effects was realized, it was then realized that it is not the lateral force, it is the deformation, but nevertheless the structural members are still the same, but there is a limit to what you can achieve by providing for structural elements as such, right? It so very soon hits the law of diminishing return. You cannot achieve the same amount of benefit for the material that you put in, because when you put in structural element, you are also putting in material there, and that involves costs, and that involves other things, because the material adds on to the momentum of the system, and it feeds into the deformation that are imposed on the structure. So then you need to look at other mechanisms, and this simple example, simple tool of 0.1 or 10% of the weight of the structure doesn't really take into account the complexities involved because of the eccentricities and those things, torsional effects, right? So this is a very simplistic approach, and you can see that it's almost 100 years. So we are approaching 100 years since 1923 earthquake, and obviously we have not been sitting idle for all those 100 years. There have been lots of developments in earthquake engineering, but that is, this 10% seismic weight is the cornerstone, since where we took a turn to the right for understanding the effects of earthquakes on the structure and how to withstand those earthquake effects, right? As they say, there is a lot of story still needs to be told, and that's what we will be discussing throughout this semester. Yes?
Sir, that 0.1 W, at that time it was weight. Still now we are using it with some additional factor of safety, or we are just moving to another thing now.
As I said, this is a static load, and earthquake effects are primarily dynamic phenomena. And when you talk of dynamics, then there are lots of things happen. I mean, resonance and other amplifications, frequency matching, etc., which cannot really be captured by this simply constant force. But nevertheless, it does build in some amount of capacity to absorb the deformations in lateral direction, and this is definitely better than nothing. In fact, we continued to use this lateral force method, which was subsequently rephrased as seismic coefficient method for seismic design as late as 2002. It's only in 2002 that we stopped using this static lateral force analysis for seismic design purposes. So problem is, this does not take into account the complications that may arise because of the lateral vibrations and eccentricities and coupling between the lateral deformations and the torsional deformations, which will lead to additional forces, and those forces will not be captured in this simplistic formulation. So, any other question? Okay, fine. Let's stop here. Thank you.